May 1945. A heavily guarded bridge over the Elbe River marks the tense, silent line between the American and Soviet armies. On the eastern bank, 50 yards away, dozens of liberated American prisoners of war lie sick and starving in the dirt. On the western bank, an American transport convoy idles, ready to retrieve them. But a massive Soviet tank deliberately blocks the center of the wooden bridge, its engine idling with a low, menacing rumble. The Soviet commander refuses to let the trucks pass, demanding a stack of complex, non-existent bureaucratic transit papers from high command in Moscow. It is a calculated display of geopolitical dominance using human lives as expendable political pawns. General George S. Patton will answer this bureaucratic blockade with 3 Sherman tanks, a ticking watch, and a brutal, unyielding ultimatum that forces the Soviet armor backward into the mud. This is the story of what Patton did when Soviet commanders blocked American liberators from reaching POWs. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to our channel. We tell the World War II stories that show what happened when bureaucracy met the barrel of a tank. Captain Robert Bobby Vance was a 28-year-old tank destroyer commander from Austin, Texas, serving with the 803rd Tank Destroyer Battalion. Before the war, he worked at his family's lumber yard, planning a quiet life under the Texas sun. He had enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor, trading his civilian clothes for olive drab and grease paint. He had fought through the hedgerows of Normandy, watched his closest childhood friend die in a burning M10 near Aachen, and carried a jagged piece of shrapnel in his left shoulder from the Ardennes. The war had taken his youth, his health, and his peace of mind, leaving him with an intense, quiet devotion to the men under his command. He had just driven his rescue convoy, non-stop for 18 hours, through ruined German towns, fueled by nothing but black coffee and the singular mission to bring his liberated countrymen home. Now, he sat in his command jeep at the western edge of the bridge, his knuckles white against the steering wheel as he stared across the river at the starving men. Major Ivan Volkov was a 40-year-old Soviet Red Army officer from Stalingrad, commanding an armored detachment of the First Ukrainian Front. He was a hardened, cynical veteran who had survived the brutal meat grinder of the Eastern Front, a man who viewed the entire world through the strict, unforgiving lens of communist ideology and Moscow directives. To Volkov, the Western Allies were not brothers in arms, but soft, arrogant tourists who had arrived late to a war that Russia had already won with its own blood. He sat perched comfortably atop the turret of his massive, mud-splattered T-34 tank, wearing a pristine, custom-tailored wool tunic that contrasted sharply with the rags of the prisoners below him. He took slow, deliberate draws from a lit cigarette, washing the smoke down with regular swigs from a silver canteen filled with high-proof wartime vodka. He looked down at the waiting American vehicles with a smug, heavy-lidded contempt, thoroughly enjoying the sudden bureaucratic leverage he held over these well-fed Americans. By May 1945, the European theater had dissolved into a chaotic race for territory, prisoners, and political leverage. The German war machine was completely shattered, leaving a massive power vacuum across Central Europe. The Western Allies and the Soviet Red Army were rushing from opposite directions to stake their claims, meeting along a jagged, hastily drawn line of demarcation that cut directly through the heart of Germany. Supply lines were broken, communications were deeply fractured, and local commanders on both sides were forced to make high-stakes operational decisions with almost no direct oversight from their distant capitals. This lawless, transitional environment allowed field officers to act on their personal whims and deep-seated political prejudices. Many high-ranking American and British officers, strictly adhering to diplomatic protocols from Washington, had spent weeks letting these minor Soviet infractions slide. They routinely allowed red tape, delayed transit permits, and aggressive border guards to halt necessary missions, all in the name of preserving the fragile wartime alliance. They chose diplomatic caution over immediate action, avoiding any potential friction that might trigger an international incident with Moscow. But this institutional patience had created a dangerous precedent, giving frontline Soviet officers the impression that the Western forces were timid and easily manipulated by administrative blockades. On this particular morning at the Elbe River, that administrative stalling had turned deadly. A simple crossing point had become an ideological standoff, transforming a routine prisoner exchange into a volatile display of administrative cruelty. The initial spirit of shared victory over Berlin had completely vanished, replaced by the cold, calculated posturing of a new global rivalry. The transport convoy remained completely stranded on the western approach, their engines idling in a long, dusty line while the sick men across the water waited for relief. Captain Vance stepped down from his jeep, walking onto the wooden planks of the bridge with his hands away from his sidearm. He stopped 10 feet from the front slope of the idling Soviet tank, looking up at the major on the turret. He spoke clearly, keeping his Texas drawl even and controlled. "Major, my name is Captain Vance, 803rd Tank Destroyer Battalion. I have a column of 10 empty transport trucks here to collect 64 American soldiers currently holding on the east bank of this river. Our paperwork was verified at the division checkpoint 5 miles back, and we are clear to retrieve our men." Major Volkov did not lower his canteen, swallowing before he looked down at the American captain. He blew a thick cloud of gray cigarette smoke into the damp morning air, letting the silence stretch between them for several seconds. "You have no papers that mean anything to me, Captain. The division checkpoints are an American concern. But this bridge is a Soviet position, managed under the direct authority of the Soviet command structure. Your trucks do not move 1 inch onto this timber until I hold an official, stamped transit protocol, issued directly from the administrative offices in Moscow. Sir, those men over there have been marching on raw turnips and ditch water for 3 weeks since their camp was liberated." Vance stepped a foot closer, pointing a gloved hand toward the eastern bank, where 3 American soldiers were huddled under a single threadbare blanket in the dirt. They are suffering from typhus, dysentery, and advanced malnutrition. Every single hour we sit here debating administrative jurisdiction. Those men get closer to a field grave. I am asking you as a fellow soldier and an ally to let my trucks cross, load the ambulances, and clear your checkpoint." Volkov laughed, a harsh, dry sound that rattled over the clatter of his tank engine. He dropped his cigarette butt onto the steel hull, crushing it slowly beneath the heel of his polished leather boot. "An ally is someone who bleeds for 3 years in the mud while your country builds factories and counts dollar bills, Captain. Your soft, well-fed tourists come here at the very end of the harvest and expect us to bow to your schedule. Those men in the dirt are in a Soviet occupation sector, which means they are Soviet property until Moscow says otherwise. Go back to your jeep, smoke your tobacco, and wait for the bureaucrats to sign the proper ink." Vance watched 2 Soviet infantrymen carry a heavy mahogany grandfather clock out of a nearby civilian house, tossing it carelessly into the bed of a captured German cargo truck. He looked back at Volkov, his eyes darkening as he realized the major was completely immovable. "This is an international corridor, Major, and blocking a medical retrieval column is a direct violation of standard theater agreements. I am giving you one final opportunity to order your driver to clear this lane before I report this delay directly up my chain of command." Volkov leaned forward over the turret ring, his face hardening as he sneered down at the Texan. "Report it to whoever you like, Captain. Report it to your generals. Report it to your president, or report it to the King of England. My tank stays exactly where it is, and your miserable trucks will sit in the mud until I see the proper stamps from the Kremlin. You have no authority here, and your empty threats mean nothing to the Red Army." Captain Vance turned on his heel without another word, walking back to his jeep and grabbing the radio receiver. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His open-top command car screeched to a sudden halt directly at the western bridgehead, kicking up a thick cloud of dry river dust. 4 polished brass stars gleamed brightly on his helmet liner, matching the large, embossed stars on the vehicle's bumper. His signature ivory-handled revolvers rested heavily in their custom leather holsters at his hips. The general stepped out of the vehicle with a crisp, measured stride, his tailored wool uniform immaculate despite the dusty roads. Every American soldier on the riverbank instantly snapped to rigid attention, their spines straightening as a heavy, absolute silence fell over the entire western checkpoint. Patton did not look at his own men. He kept his eyes locked on the iron shape of the Soviet vehicle, blocking the center of the wooden span. He walked directly onto the bridge planks, his voice quiet, cold, and controlled. Patton studied him. "Ho is the commanding officer of this armored vehicle." Major Volkov remained seated on his turret hatch, leaning back on one elbow as he looked down at the 4 stars. "I am Major Volkov, commander of this detachment. Are you the officer responsible for halting this medical retrieval column?" "I am following my orders, General. No foreign vehicles cross this line without validated documents from the High Command." Patton's voice was quiet, but it carried across the water. "Major, you are currently looking at 3 American M4 Sherman tanks from the Fleet Marine Force that have just leveled their 75mm main guns directly at your engine compartment." Volkov turned his head, his face instantly losing its color as he saw the steel turrets rotating into position. "This is an Allied checkpoint, General. You cannot threaten a Soviet position. You have exactly 60 seconds to order your driver to engage his transmission and clear this bridge. If that tank is still sitting on these timbers, when the second hand on my watch completes 1 full rotation, my gunners will blow your vehicle directly into the river. The Third Army will consider your presence an act of open hostility, and we will clear this corridor by force. I am not here to negotiate with your clerks, and I am not here to request your administrative permission. I am here to collect my men, and we are crossing this river today." Volkov stared into the general's eyes, looking for any sign of diplomatic hesitation or political bluff. He saw only the cold, absolute certainty of immediate violence. The Soviet major dropped his canteen, his hands shaking as he frantically signaled toward the lower hatch. The heavy T-34 tank engine roared to life with a sudden explosion of black diesel exhaust, its massive steel tracks grinding violently against the wooden timbers of the bridge. The Soviet driver threw the transmission into reverse, forcing the 30-ton war machine backward off the span and into the soft, churned mud of the eastern riverbank. Major Volkov stood in his turret hatch, his hands gripping the rim as he watched the American Sherman tanks remain completely stationary, their barrels tracked tightly on his retreat. With the crossing point suddenly cleared, Captain Vance signaled the waiting transport convoy forward. The 10 heavy American trucks rolled across the wooden planks in a slow, synchronized column, their rubber tires thumping over the timber. On the eastern bank, the emaciated American prisoners watched the incoming vehicles with hollow, disbelief-filled eyes, some weeping silently as medical orderlies lifted them from the dirt. The Soviet troops looting the nearby houses stopped their pilfering, standing in silence along the roadside as the rescue operation was completed without a single document or official signature changing hands. Patton stood at the center of the bridgehead until the last truck cleared the checkpoint, his presence alone dictating the terms of the entire extraction. Captain Robert "Bobby" Vance returned to Austin, Texas, after the war, operating his family's lumber yard until his retirement in 1978. He carried the physical toll of his wartime injuries for the rest of his days, but he often told his children that the sight of those 64 men crossing the Elbe River was the single proudest moment of his life. He died quietly at his home in 1991, surrounded by his family. Major Ivan Volkov faced an investigation by his superiors regarding his tactical withdrawal, resulting in a quiet reassignment to a remote garrison in the Soviet interior. He remained bitter about his brief encounter with the American armored units, spending his later years writing unpublished memoirs that condemned Western military aggression before his death in Gorky in 1968. General George S. Patton never mentioned the bridgehead confrontation during his official press briefings, preferring to keep the administrative dispute out of the public eye to protect alliance politics. He did, however, describe the entire incident in a private letter written to his wife just 3 days after the standoff occurred. He noted that the only way to deal with an administrative blockade was to show the absolute certainty of force. He wrote that some men only understand the rules of a bureaucrat until they are forced to look directly down the dark rifling of a 75-millimeter gun barrel. Some historians have argued that General Patton's aggressive behavior at the Elbe River bridgehead was reckless, suggesting that his willingness to threaten a fellow Allied power over an administrative crossing protocol could have broken the fragile agreements made at the Yalta Conference and sparked an early international conflict. They claim that field commanders should always prioritize diplomatic caution over local, tactical problems. Other historians have argued the exact opposite, defending Patton's unyielding actions as a necessary display of strength that prevented Soviet forces from exploiting Western hesitation and establishing a dangerous pattern of frontline intimidation. What is certain is that 64 sick and starving American soldiers were successfully brought across that river without a single casualty or delay. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have waited for official orders from high command? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about what happened when bureaucracy met the barrel of a tank, make sure to subscribe.